that we've been using the terminology around phase. We've used the term randomized. There's some, blinded. There's some key research terms that when we talk about them are important to understand when you're thinking about clinical trials. So I am going to hopefully successfully pull this up. And
all right. Terrific.
There. So we'll use this as our guide a little bit for a few minutes to talk about some of these terms. Do you start us off with some of them?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start us off, which is, so every drug that gets developed is first studied in the lab. And that's this preclinical, can you see? Oh, yeah. I'm going to let you, Dr. Wethington, be the mouse since I don't have control of it. So this preclinical area, and that's where we're trying to understand the mechanism of action. How does this drug work? How is it metabolized? Other key features, how does it get into the cancer cells, for example? What other cells in the body that it might have effects on? And then toxicity in animals. And here it estimated that this time frame can be 3 to 6 years. And I would say, honestly, it tends to be a lot longer than that. We may identify a particular target for a drug, and that may be known in the example of P53, which is the most common mutation in high-grade serous ovarian cancer, present in greater than 95% of high-grade serous ovarian cancer, perhaps all of them. We've known about that gene for 50 years, and yet, we still don't really have drugs to truly target that. But in any case, they're all studied in the lab first, so that we can gain as much information as possible. When a drug is coming out of the lab and is being considered for use in patients, they first undergo a phase 1 study. And phase 1 is actually a bucket that includes many different types of studies. For example, some of them may be first in human, meaning that this drug has never been used in people before. Obviously, someone somewhere has to be the very first person to ever receive the drug. And we need to figure out what the proper dose of the drug is and what the toxicity profile or side effect profile looks like. And so that's done in these phase 1 studies. However, it also includes studies of FDA-approved drugs that are being used in a different way. So for example, an FDA-approved drug that is being administered instead of IV, let's say it's being administered intraperitoneally, that would need to be studied in a phase 1 study. Or an FDA-approved drug that is being used now in combination with another FDA-approved drug. And even though we know the proper dose of each of those drugs individually, we don't know what the doses should be when used together. They may have overlapping toxicity profiles, and we want to make sure that giving both drugs at the same time is not going to be a safety issue. And so that's studied in a phase 1 trial. These phase 1 trials are often fairly small. Sometimes they may be at most 50 patients. Frequently, they actually span a number of different types of cancers. So you may have one patient with colon cancer, another one with breast cancer, and a third with a GYN cancer. And of course, we're always interested in how well it has worked for each of the patients enrolled in the study. What we're going to get at the end of this study is information about dosing and side effect profile, and a smidgen of information about efficacy, because all we can really say is if there was one patient with breast cancer who responded to the drug on the study, that one patient with breast cancer responded to the drug, and that's not, doesn't really help us determine whether or not this is a useful drug in the patient, in the general breast cancer population. Phase 2 is where we then get that next first look at efficacy. These tend to be sort of medium-sized trials, perhaps 100 or so patients. Now all of the patients tend to have the same type of cancer. There are other similar features about the cancer or the patient population to try to homogenize and get a sense, perhaps based on the preclinical information of what's predicted to be the best population to use it in, or the phase 1 information that may guide that as well, that you're trying to hone in on a population you think is going to be most likely to benefit. And so these sometimes are randomized studies, often are not, and everybody's receiving the same drug and the same doses at the drugs, at least to start out with. From these studies, we often get a indication of whether or not across that group of patients there was benefit. And we can typically tell you in terms of percentages how many patients had a response to therapy, or what was the duration of time that they stayed on the therapy before their cancer got worse. Then, of course, the next question, though, is this new drug that looks promising better than what we're already doing, the standard of care? And so that's where a phase 3 study comes in, where now we want to have a larger population. These can be a few hundred patients, sometimes even thousands of patients. And we are treating patients with the study drugs, but there's also a group of patients who are going to receive what's considered the standard of care. And we're comparing those two groups. So again, we're trying to homogenize across the groups, make sure that they're similar, so that really, hopefully, the main thing that's different is what they've been treated with, so that we can see whether these drugs are better than what we're already doing. It's based on that information, and that's really what we call the gold standard that the FDA in the United States would use to evaluate whether or not the drug gets approved for that cancer. Post-approval, there's then a whole series of studies that can happen at that point. They're called post-marketing studies, or some of them are phase 4 studies. And that's where we're trying to identify further information about safety, efficacy, optimal use, perhaps, again, further honing in on subpopulations to make sure that it's safe or efficacious. And so all of this can take quite a long time. I often get the question of, gosh, why aren't things moving forward faster? And in fact, we've made a lot of advances in terms of how to design these studies to make those leaps and progress along this timeline faster, but it still just takes time. There are a number of regulatory hurdles and other things that do play into that timeline, but the FDA has understood that cancer patients want to have efficacious drugs as quickly as possible. And so they have also generated ways to help move these studies along and hopefully gain approval. Oh, you're still muted.
Ooh, it took me 3 nights to do that. I was doing okay, and then I just messed it all up. I was going through all 5 without forgetting my mute button. So that helped us sort of frame the phasing and understanding the development like beautifully, so helpful. Some of those terms, Amy or Dr. Armstrong, help us out with, like randomized and blinded, and some of those other phrases, that jargon that commonly comes up. We'll start with those two. Does one of you want to help us with those definitions?
Yeah, I'll start. So a randomized trial is a trial where there will be more than one option for therapy, and the patient doesn't get to choose which option they want, and the treating providers don't get to choose which option they want. We used to call it a coin flip, but it's really a computer generated thing right now. And so, when somebody goes into the trial, as a physician, I have to be happy with all of the potential treatments they could get on the trial, and the patient has to be willing to accept those treatments. And frequently in a randomized trial, as Dr. Gayard said, it will be the standard of care versus a new agent. And the only way we really know is if that's going to, you know, push the envelope is to compare it to a standard of care. There are also, and Amy was talking about the PARP inhibitor studies. So this whole issue of maintenance after standard chemotherapy with PARP inhibitors, it was subject of a randomized trial. And in those situations, this is people who had finished chemotherapy, they had responded to treatment, and now they're randomized to the PARP inhibitor versus a placebo, because no treatment at the end of chemotherapy is the standard. So the placebo is the standard arm. The experimental arm is the PARP inhibitor. And again, those are blinded trials. You don't know which arm you're on, and you can't choose which arm you're on, but you will know, hey, Luke, whether or not, what the odds are that you would be able to be on any one of those arms. And so that's what the randomization is. Some people, what I usually tell people is, you know, you will at least get the standard of care, and you might have the option of getting something investigational. And as Dr. Gayard was talking about with the GOG 281, it was a lovely trial design because everybody who went on that trial, even if they got randomized to the standard arm, could get the investigational drug later on. So that was a trial design that was really a very easy to, I think, to talk to people about, and people were enthusiastic about that. Amy, why don't you talk a little bit about this? Because Amy really spends a lot of time talking to patients about what this means.
I'm going to say, you know, so in every clinical trial, they tell us sort of what the randomization is, at least what the plan is. Like some are 2 to 1, some are 4 to 4 to 1 to 1 to, you know, and they all, you have to kind of explain, you know, how that's going to work, you know, depending on the number of arms on a study, right? And then, and some studies are weighted more heavily on certain arms of the study than others. So it's not just, you know, as much as people want to say, if you're randomized, it's like flipping a coin, right? And sometimes it's a 2-sided coin. Sometimes, you know, it's an 8-sided coin, you know, where 50% of the time it's heads, or, you know, whatever it is. And so it does get complicated, but I do spend time going over what that randomization is for the specific study. I think you're right, Stephanie Wethington, in saying that patients get confused. They're like, well, what does it mean to be blinded? You know, and are you blinded? You know, are we just blinded? You know, is the pharmacy blinded? And it's different in every trial. In some cases, even the pharmacy doesn't know if you're getting the drug or if you're not getting the drug. So it can be, that's what we call double blind. Or most of the time, we are blinded to it as your providers, but the pharmacy is aware of the drug, but you, the patient, and us, the providers, don't know whether or not you're getting the drug. I think placebo is sort of a 4-letter word, you know, everybody gets very nervous about placebos. But then again, just as Dr. Armstrong just mentioned, you're never going to not get treatment. You know, we're not, you know, you have cancer, you are going to get treatment, you know, and you may get additional drug. I think it's not necessarily a buzzword, but I think one of the questions that we get a lot in trials, especially for women with recurrent GYN cancers, is how long am I going to be on the trial? Because in initial therapy, we sort of tell them, well, you're going to have 6 cycles of treatment, or you're going to have 4 cycles, or, you know, there's a set plan in mind. And when it comes to trials, especially, like I said, in recurrent disease, they can be open-ended. So, you know, as long as you're receiving a benefit, we're going to keep going, or there could have a maximum of, say, 24 months, you know? And so I think that's another big question I get when it comes to trials that's very different from standard of care therapy. You know, you usually think, all right, well, I got 3 cycles, I'm going to get a scan. They told me I'd probably get 6 cycles. And then, so I think that's a big change in what how their brain works when they start thinking about treatment. Just because this is a current problem I'm experiencing. Another question is about who pays